Okay. Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second and final part of your summer assignment. We're going to be looking at the way the Catholic Church effectively responded to the challenges faced in the 14th century. The last video we talked about some of those challenges, and here we're going to talk about a little bit of what's going on with the Catholic Church. So to accompany this video, you should have downloaded this worksheet here. We're going to be filling out this worksheet. You should have already done this reading on the Avignon papacy, which we're going to discuss in this video. So please make sure if you haven't done this reading and answered the questions yet, make sure you stop this, do that first, and then we're going to discuss all of these events here. Okay. So if you recall the last video, we discussed some of the problems, famine, war, disease, plague that had been hitting Europe in the 14th century. Now, to start with this video, let's go backwards a little bit and do a little review. What I'd like you guys to do right now is to think back from 9th grade and try to brainstorm a little bit the answers that would go next to these bullets. So the role of the Catholic Church during the Middle Ages. What kind of role did they play in people's lives? What role did they play in European society? What criticisms came about because of the church? And what was the relationship between the kings and the Pope? So try to think a little bit about this. Maybe take a second right now on your worksheet, just jot down any of the things you remember about any of these bubbles. Okay, so hopefully what you're thinking here, the role of the church, something along these lines. The church in the Middle Ages provided stability in a very unstable time. Remember, the Middle Ages was a time of warfare and violence and a lack of a central authority. The closest thing to a central authority across Western Europe was the Roman Catholic Church. Part of the reason why they provided stability and why they did have power is because they gave the sacraments. This is a time of great religious belief amongst the people of Europe. They lived in a very difficult time. The average life expectancy for a person was about 30 years old, so they lived short, hard, difficult lives. So to them, what they were trying to get to was the afterlife. Deal with your life here on earth. It's difficult, it's hard, but then you shall have the glory of heaven. Now, in order to get into heaven, you had to have all your sacraments. Well, the church was the one who provided the sacraments to you, so that gave them an immense amount of power over the people. They are also one of the only institutions that provided education. The vast majority of people could not read or write. Those that could tended to be monks or clergymen that learned how to read because of the church. This is something that we're going to discuss a little bit later on in the first unit about how education kind of shifts away from this later on. They are also the most powerful force because of all of these. So they were very influential. The Pope was the head of the Catholic Church, and he proclaimed what has been called papal supremacy, meaning that his word was above everybody else's. Kings, lords, nobles, everybody else. If you lived in a Roman Catholic area, the Pope was the top. He had the last say on everything. So now with great power comes great responsibility, and a lot of people criticize the church for not living up to this responsibility. So some of the criticisms you might remember from 9th grade should include corruption. They became very corrupt. A lot of the secular rulers criticized them for being more powerful than them. Secular rulers meaning kings and the lords. Secular meaning non-religious. They also were criticized for owning large amounts of land, that they became too wealthy, and they used this wealth to live lives of extravagance at the expense of the people. They charged very high fees for things like marriage and baptisms and those sacraments. In general, the big criticism was that they were beginning to abuse their power. They were charging too much for things, that they were having parties and banquets and feasts and living lives that really were not quote-unquote holy lives. So those criticisms were building up also during the 14th century. Now finally, the relationship between the kings and the Pope. Basically, this relationship was filled with tension. essentially because there began to be disagreements over who was the most powerful. Now, if you recall in the last video, we talked about how the Middle Ages lords were more powerful than the kings. In the 14th century, particularly especially in France after that Hundred Years' War, kings are starting to become more powerful and more influential. So as the king's power is increasing, they are going to now become more or have more tension with the Pope. So that's what we're going to discuss here, because the tensions between monarchs and the Pope came to a head in 1309 with something that was called the Avignon Papacy. So the official definition of this period was the time between 1309 and 1378, when the papacy was moved from Rome to Avignon, France. So today, as you should know, the center of the papacy is in Rome. It had always been in Rome, but except for this 70 or so years where the Pope was seated in France instead. Now this is going to have a very great impact on the status of the church and the role of the church in Europe. So sometimes this period is also referred to as the Babylonian captivity. So the Avignon papacy refers to the period from 1309 to 1378, when the seat of the papacy was in Avignon, France. Pope Clement V chose to move the papal court to southeastern France because of the turbulence in Rome caused by the conflict between his predecessor and King Philip of France. Because of Philip's role in the election of Clement V, many have argued that he was pressured by Philip to move the papacy to Avignon. 6 popes would reign in Avignon before the papacy returned to Rome. This period was referred to by Martin Luther and other reformers as the Babylonian captivity, an allusion to the exile of the Jews in Babylon in the 6th century BCE. So that's why sometimes it's called the Babylon captivity. To these reformers that came about afterwards, it was basically the papacy being held in captivity in France. So let's get some background and some ideas of what happened here. So the major players in this were Philip the Fair, who was the King Philip IV of France at the time, and Pope Boniface VIII. I know it talked about Clement before, but Boniface is his predecessor. So before Clement is Pope, Pope Boniface is the Pope. So really the background of this Avignon papacy has to do with the conflict between these two men right here. So again, you should have already done this reading and answered these 3 questions. So let's talk a little bit about some of the answers you should have came up with here. So the causes of the Avignon papacy. Well, there's conflict between the King of France, Philip, and the Pope, Boniface. There's disenchantment with papal rule, and which accumulates with the election of a French pope, which leads to riots in Rome. And that's really why the papacy was moved to Avignon, which we're going to talk about more in a second. Okay, so what specific issues did the Pope and the King of France disagree on? Well, again, there were a number of different issues, but the root of these issues had to do with power. Who was more supreme? Was the Pope more supreme, or was it the king? Obviously, the king felt it should be him. The Pope felt it should be him. So the specific issues where this manifested itself was first on the question of whether or not church officials should be tried in secular courts. So you had church courts, and then you had non-religious courts. So the idea here was that any clergyman or church official, if they were accused of a crime, they would be tried in the church court, not in a secular court. So if you think about this might be a little weird. Imagine if, a local priest commits a crime, and that they are tried in a church court instead of at your local secular court. It caused a lot of problems, and a lot of people felt like this wasn't fair and it wasn't right, because trying in a church court would probably protect the clergymen as opposed to try them for their crimes. So that was kind of an issue here as well. The other big issue was over canon law. Canon law is church law, the laws of the church. So again, we have this argument of what's more superior. Is church law and canon law more superior, or did secular law override that? Which laws were the supreme law of the land? Philip would have said it was the secular laws. Pope Boniface says, no, canon law supersedes everything. So you had those issues as well. And finally, the idea of taxes. Now, the church itself demanded taxes from the people in the form of what were called tithes. Everybody were required to pay somewhere around 10% of their income to the church in the form of these tithes. Now, as the kings and the secular rulers are becoming more powerful. They are also now wanting to collect taxes from their people. So the question became, well, the church land is on the land of the King of France, the church should pay taxes also. But the Pope said, no, 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 we are superior, we do not have to pay your taxes, we should be exempt. So that was also an issue here between the king and the Pope. So again, these are the specific issues that took place leading up to this Avignon papacy, but you can notice here the key issue is that they're disagreeing on supremacy. Who is more powerful? That is the root of this conflict. So what do the events surrounding the Avignon papacy display about the conditions in Europe during this time? You should be thinking something along the lines of that there was division, there was tension, we're seeing a rise of power in kings, we're starting to see the church power be challenged for the first time during the Middle Ages. And we can see here that there's just generally some instability and problems going on. So specifically, here's what happened. So you have the problem between Boniface and Philip going on that you just read about. Now, when Boniface dies, Philip takes this as an opportunity, and he's like, well, I'm sick of having problems with this pope, so I'm going to make sure that a Frenchman is elected pope next. So he, through some maneuverings, probably through some bribery, things like that, convinced the College of Cardinals to elect a Frenchman to the papacy, Clement V. So Clement V is a Frenchman. Now, the people of Rome are not happy with this election. They felt like it was just Philip putting his own puppet into the papacy. He felt like it wasn't or the people felt like it wasn't right, and they refused to pay taxes to this new pope. They refused to provide military service, and they have some general riots throughout the city. Well, Clement, who decided he was fearing for his life, chose to move the papacy to Avignon to get themselves out of this aggressive atmosphere of Rome and to what he thought was the safety of Avignon. Now, you can argue about, was truly his life in danger? Were there really problems? Did Philip, a lot of people have argued that Philip convinced him to move the papacy to France, because think about it, that works in Philip's favor. Now he has the Pope right there. Now he was instrumental in having this Pope elected, so basically he can manipulate this Pope the way that he wants. So now, regardless of the reasons or why it happened, in 1309, the papacy now is existing in Avignon, France. And we will see 6 more popes after Clement continue this policy of residing in Avignon instead of Rome. So from 1305 or 1309 until about 1378, the popes will continue to have the seat of the papacy in Avignon, France. So what's the issue with this? Well, the majority of the men that Clement V appointed as cardinals were French, and since the cardinals elected the pope, this meant that future popes were likely to be French as well. All 7 of the Avignonese popes and 111 of the 134 cardinals created during the Avignon papacy were French. Although the Avignonese popes were able to maintain a measure of independence, the French kings did exert some influence from time to time, and the appearance of French influence on the papacy, whether real or not, was undeniable. So you're going to have some problems here across Europe that people think that there's too much French influence and that basically the French king is controlling the papacy. Now, there were some other criticisms of this period of the Avignon papacy as well. And what we're going to do here is we're going to stop and look at the back of the worksheet that you should have, or the second page of the worksheet, and look at a reading from Petrarch. Petrarch is one of the most influential European thinkers. We will talk about him a little bit when we start the period of the Renaissance, because he is considered to be a forerunner of the Renaissance, one of the great early thinkers who brought a lot of these ideas, or these new ideas of the Renaissance, to the surface, particularly the idea of focusing on the classics, meaning the writings and ideas from ancient Greece and ancient Rome. So he was absorbed with the classics, he studied all these, he saw this period as the greatest period in history, and he is very influential in getting the classics back into people's minds in Europe. Anyway, he was a great writer, and what we're going to look at here is a document where he is writing a letter to a friend criticizing the Avignon papacy. So let's take a second here, pause the video, look over that reading, and just answer the question below. So, okay, based on the document, what were the major criticisms against the papacy during its time at Avignon? Well, you should have something along the lines of that the popes were living too extravagant a lifestyle. Petrarch talks about how they were decked in gold, how they had all these feasts. People are outside starving and they're having banquets with alcohol and food and as much as you can eat. So that was one big criticism there, as well as the criticism we discussed before that there was too much French influence here. So the period of the Avignon papacy will be important because you will see here a lot of criticisms against the papacy and against the Pope and saying, well, you're taking it out of their ancient seat, you're moving it to another country, you're having too much French influence, and then instead of living holy lives, you're basically just living these amazing, ridiculous lifestyles. And you can see here, this is the papal complex at Avignon. I mean, giant mansions, humongous, at the expense of the people all around them. So the criticisms here and the issues and the tensions now building with the Pope in Avignon will lead to something called the Great Schism of 1378. Now this is usually called the Great Western Schism, not to be confused with the Great Schism you should have learned about last year, where the Eastern Orthodox Church split. This is different because this just involves the Western Roman Catholic Church. But, the idea of a schism does happen. You will see a split here. So the Great Schism is a period where two, and then later three, men claimed to be the true pope. One ruled from Avignon and one from Rome. So let's see, how does this happen? Well, in 1377, Pope Gregory X brought the papacy back to Rome. He dies shortly afterwards. At this point, the Roman citizens who are sick of French influence and sick of all these French popes and all these French cardinals, they put pressure on the cardinals to choose an Italian. And they do. They choose an Italian, Pope Urban VI. However, what they did not realize is that Urban VI was going to be a reformer. He was going to say, hey, there was just 70 years of issues and problems and criticisms against the church. Let's try to fix them. So his reforms become a direct threat to the cardinals and their way of life and their status. And he basically says, hey, cardinals, you have to stop. You have to start living better lives and start doing more holy things, or I'm going to excommunicate you. Well, the cardinals don't take too well to this, and they decide to meet secretly and say, we were just kidding. Pope Urban's election, that wasn't true. It was an invalid election. There were problems, so we're going to actually say his election doesn't count, and not only that, but we're going to excommunicate him. So the cardinals go and do that, and they elect a new pope, and shockingly, they go back to the cousin of the King of France, and they elect Clement VII as the new pope. Well, Urban, who had nothing to do with any of these meetings or any of this, he doesn't accept this, and he says, no, we followed all the procedures the right way. I am the true pope. I am the direct representative of God. I'm going to stay pope. So in 1378, we have two popes, one Urban VI out of Rome, and one Clement VII in France. So this is going to divide European powers because you're going to align yourself with your different popes along political lines, and it becomes a political issue here, not a religious issue. So the Pope at Rome had the support of England, the Holy Roman Empire, and Portugal, whereas the Pope at Avignon had France, Scotland, Aragon, and Castile. So you can see on this map here the division along religious lines. And then some areas in the middle of the Holy Roman Empire, shifting their allegiances a little bit. But the issue, if you look at this map, you can see here this clear division on who is the true pope, the one in Avignon or the one in Rome. And this is going to cause a lot of problems for the church. Just think about the fact of, if this happened in our country today. You have an election coming up and a new president is elected, but the old president was like, nope, I'm not going to leave the White House. And what kind of problems would that cause? It would cause issues. It would make us look bad to the rest of the world. And that is kind of what's happening here in the church, is that people don't know who the true pope is. They had said throughout all the years about the Pope is God's representative, the Pope has the direct support of God, and yet now which one do you choose? Who is the right one? So it really discredits a lot of what the church is saying. And you can see here that the impact of this Great Western Schism. The longer this schism lasts, the more it appears to be costing and the more harm it does. Scandals, massacres, ruinations, agitations, troubles, and disturbances. So essentially, as long as the schism went on, it was causing immense damage to the power and the status of the church. Well, the schism will last until 1417. Around 1409, the clergy across Europe called for a council to heal this schism. The council had decided that they're going to remove both popes and elect a new one. Well, neither one of the popes decided to accept the decision of the council, so those two popes remained popes, and now you add a third pope. So for 5 years, there are not one, not two, but 3 popes across Europe. This becomes a disaster. Not only does it cause divisions within the church, but it also is a big PR nightmare for them. I mean, how are they supposed to say that they are this legitimate, superior authority with the blessing of God when they can't even get their crap together? So in 1414, the Holy Roman Emperor decides for a new council, meeting in Constance, and basically says, you guys figure this out because you have to. So the council at Constance removes that new pope. They accepted the resignation of the Roman pope, and they managed to, through diplomacy and other means, convince the other European powers to dismiss the claims of the Avignon pope. So this council manages to basically convince everybody, hey, this has gone on long enough. We're looking terrible. It is causing immense problems and division in our church. Let's start over. So at this point, the council manages to heal the schism, and a new pope, Martin V, is elected. Martin V brings the papacy back to Rome, and all is well again. But all was not truly well, because the damage had already been done. This Great Western Schism had a huge impact on the church. Number one, it weakened the legitimacy of the Catholic Church. As I was saying before, is that here you have them saying all these things about doctrine and dogma and all of this, and they can't even get their crap together. They can't even figure out who is the head of their church. It led to a lot of criticism of the church, the criticisms that Petrarch talked about the extravagance of the Avignon papacy. It led to criticisms about, like, how legitimate can they really be if they can't figure out who is the actual pope, and it led to divisions and issues between the different people in the church, which is going to weaken the power of the church. For the first time really in the Middle Ages, the power of the church is being directly challenged here, and we're going to see a continuing of this idea as the centuries go on. So to wrap up here, the aim of this was how effectively did the Catholic Church deal with the problems of the 14th century. The last part of this assignment will be for you to create a written answer to this question, using specific details from the readings that you did, from the worksheet, and from this video. So hopefully at this point you have enough information to write that. Remember, just jot down any questions that you might have when we discuss it in the first day of class. You can ask me any of the questions that you have, and we are going to be picking up with all of this information when I see you guys in September. So thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see everybody soon.